Well, welcome to our 8th week and on the journey of considering when the church gets it right. This has been a fascinating journey for me because I'm just like many of you. I'm tempted to get pretty cynical and pretty critical about institutions, even the church that's important to me. But to get on the positive side and discover when the church gets it right is really been a good journey for me, and I hope it's as good or at least of interest to you. Remembering our working definition of the church, in case you haven't been with us for these other weeks, the church is a human endeavor to organize and ordain the followers of Jesus. And the church gets it right when its attitudes and actions are aligned with agape love, revealed in the life of Jesus. Now, we've looked at the characteristics so far of being sent, being bold, being partners, being diverse, bearing shalom, being conservative, and being liberal. This week, we'll look at a characteristic that is uncommon, but when it is experienced, it is radically defining. That is, the church gets it right when we have a preference for the poor. Now, my own personal journey in discovering this characteristic began 50 years ago. I'd completed seminary, being thoroughly oriented to European-based theological inquiry. The books we read, the ideas we probed, the discussions we experienced were all scripted, if you will, by European theologians. But following seminary, I was challenged to read the thoughts of liberation theology, primarily given birth in Latin and South America. These theologians were not all scholars, but they were practicing parish priests whose thought was based on a careful study of the life and teachings of Jesus. That when the chips were down in the life of Jesus, when the chips were on the table, Jesus always had a preference for the poor. Liberation theology was committed to liberating the poor from the bondage and the ensnarements of poverty. Therefore, liberation theology, not just in one's mind, but when in practice, the actions of agape love were for the poor, and became very attractive to me because the theological training I'd received was bearing no fruit in Europe. The church in Europe was declining, but the church in Latin and South America was vibrant in mission. And at the same time, I read one of the most influential books that I have read in my life. The title of it was Count Me Out, a book by Colin Morris, which is his story in Africa of the church neglecting and ignoring the poor. In response, he said, if that's the church, pretending to follow Jesus, but neglecting and ignoring the poor, count me out. For 50 years, I have time and time discovered that the church is most alive, most mission-oriented, when it has the characteristic of having a preference for the poor. A couple years ago, the story of two neighboring churches that encountered the great flood in Houston. One of the churches opened the door to the plight of every person who encountered the devastation of floodwaters in their home. Thousands slept on pews, slept on the floor, shared every corner of the facility, including the pastor's office, as their temporary home. However, after some time, most persons were getting back on their feet, back to their homes, but many remained. And of course, you know who those were. They were the permanently poor who had no place and no voice to be heard. The church became their place. The church became their voice. Over weeks and months, they were led by the life and teachings of Jesus, who had a preference for the poor. The other congregation, not too many blocks away, kept their doors locked. No one slept in that pristine place, whose walls were not to be scratched, or floors abused by the traffic of thousands, unless they were coming to hear the preaching of the prosperity gospel. The understanding that faithfulness leads to economic prosperity and has no relevance for the poor. You see, one church got it right. The mission to all, including the wealthy and the middle class, and when the poor remained in their place, the church became their place. The church became their voice. And I think the other church got it wrong, preaching and teaching and behaving and understanding that the church has a preference for the haves, not the have-nots. Now, many similar stories can be told, for church history is marked by periods of time and incidents in every period of time when the church has had a preference for the haves rather than the have-nots. However, it is very clear to me in my journey that the church from time to time and at every time gets it right when its place is with the poor and whose voice is for the poor, as Jesus taught, inasmuch as you do it to one of the least of these, you do it to me. Let me repeat that so we just don't take it casually. Jesus said, inasmuch as you do it to one of the least of these, you do it to me. When the church neglects and ignores the poor, the church rejects and ignores Jesus. However, when the church is the place with and for the voice of the poor, the church gets it right. For agape love, sacrificial and empathetic love, becomes the lantern of light which guides the church in its mission and ministry. Remember the old song, The Old Lamplighter? The old lamplighter carried the light. And indeed, the church carries the light for the poor, to be sure their voice is always heard. And agape love commands that the church will be a place for the poor and speak with the poor, that their voice will be heard evermore. Indeed, you see, I think one of the characteristics of the church in mission, when the church gets it right, is when the church has a preference for the poor. It's a pretty disturbing message, but a lot to think about, and I could welcome your thought and your conversation and give you an introduction to that with these questions. What are your personal stories of saying, count me out, when you experience the church having a preference for the establishment? What are your personal stories of being attracted to the church having a preference for the poor? And how is the church providing a place for and being the voice of the poor in the community where you live? Enjoy the journey. Thank you.